Hello, this is Tony Blazer for the Motocross Vault presented by Blinzall. If you're in the market for some high-quality racing oil for your two-stroke or four, make sure you go to blinzall.com and use our discount code VAULT20 to save 20% at checkout. Thank you for all the support.
Hey, this is David Iser from DMXS Radio, and you are about to get roosted in the Motocross Vault.
Welcome back to the Motocross Vault. My name is Tony Blazer, and what this video is going to cover is a look back at Honda's all-new for 1986 XR250. I'm a huge fan of XRs. I've had several of them. Got one on my shirt right here. Big fun. There's great do-it-all motorcycles. Some of the bigger ones, like the 500 and 600s, they make pretty good desert mounts. The 250s, Honda always tried to market them as like a competitive enduro racer. I don't think unless you were in a really tight enduro, you were probably going to be too psyched on the performance of the XR, but as a play bike, they are just awesome. They're so fun. My buddy Jamie just picked up an 87, very similar to this 86. They were great machines. He had one back in the day. I've ridden this bike quite a bit. They're just like, as I said, just really fun motorcycles. As long as you take it with a grain of salt that it's not going to rip your arms out of your sockets in terms of power or anything like that. If you just want a bike to kick it and go and ride all day long, the XRs are awesome. So this video is going to cover the all-new for 86 model. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the history of the XR250s, I have done a retrospective of the entire line from 1979, I think was the first year, until they were finally retired in the early 2000s. And you can find that on my channel as well. I've done one on the XR350, the XR500 as well as many other motocross bikes. So if you are an XR fan, there's a fair amount of content on my channel. If you're into motocross and ATVs and stuff, there's also probably something you can find there as well. If you'd like to support what I do here at the Motocross Vault, I do have XR merch available on my Teespring store. I have several different XR designs, as well as, Honda, Suzuki, Kawasaki, even KTM motocross machines. If you'd like to check out some of that stuff and support what I do, I'll put a link in the description below and a card in the video. So here, without further ado, is a look back at Honda's all-new for 1986 XR250R. Today, Honda is a 100% four-stroke company. They produce four-cycle lawnmowers, watercraft, weed eaters, generators, ATVs, cars, and of course motorcycles. There's not an oil burner to be found in their entire product portfolio. They were the last of the big four to produce a two-stroke, and the first of the big four to completely abandon them. For Honda, the four-stroke motor is baked into their DNA. Even when the two-stroke was king, Big Red steadfastly stuck to producing valve and cam racers. The first of these was Honda's revolutionary XR75. Introduced for the 1973 season, the little silver thumper went head-to-head against the two-strokes of its day and introduced a generation of young racers to the joys of Honda ownership. In 1979, Honda added two more XRs to the mix with the introduction of the original XR250 and XR500. Using air-cooled overhead cam 4-valve singles, the 250 and 500 were billed as legitimate alternatives to the lightweight two-strokes of their day. Honda's literature at the time proclaimed that you could leave the two-stroke competition behind. Although the 500 made a decent desert mount, the 250 was too slow, heavy, and underpowered to be much of a woods weapon. Saddled with the weight of a 500, the power of a 200, and a peculiar 23-inch front wheel, the original XR250 was a nice play bike, but not much of a racer. In 1981, Honda gave the XR250 its first major upgrade by ditching the dual shocks of the original and replacing them with a version of the work-style Pro-Link single-shock arrangements found on their factory motocross racers. In addition to the fancy shock, the XR250 received sleek new bodywork and a change to a more conventional 21-inch front wheel. In the rear, Honda downsized from an 18-inch rear wheel to a 17-inch in the pursuit of more compliance on the trail. With the addition of the new Pro-Link rear end, the XR also adopted a new name, taking on the R designation for the first time in 1981. In the motor department, the new XR250R retained the air cooling and single overhead cam pent roof design of the original. With its 249 cc's and 4-valve per cylinder, the XR was torquey but not particularly fast. In today's cross-country racing, that would have been a death sentence, but in the off-road world of 1981, that was less of a handicap. At the time, enduro racing was still king, and in that arena, the easy-to-ride XR could be a fairly competitive mount. Unlike modern GNCC racing, which is more or less a motocross through the woods, enduro racing was much more about consistency than outright speed. Staying on time was the key, and the XR's smooth and tractable motor made that job easier. The XR was certainly no powerhouse, but it was pleasant and easy to handle. If the race was really tight and snotty, the XR actually had a decent shot at keeping the two strokes in sight. If the course was more wide open, however, the smokers were going to leave the poor little thumper in their dust. For 1983, Honda tried to address the power deficiencies of their XR line by introducing an all-new motor design. Making its debut on the XR350 and XR500R, the all-new engine used a hemispherical combustion chamber, narrow-angled valves, and a centrally located plug to provide a faster and more efficient burn than the old pent-roof design. Coined the Radial 4-Valve Combustion Chamber, or RFVC, by Honda, the new head allowed a higher compression ratio and more valve area to promote a better flow of fuel in and out of the combustion chamber. In addition to the new heads, the new RFVC motors used an advanced dual-port intake that allowed a smoother and longer flow of power. Using a pair of piston valve carbs, the new XRs fed fuel to the motor from one or two intake runners based on throttle position. From idle to half throttle, the engine drew fuel from one carburetor to provide a smoother and more precise response. Past half throttle, the second intake circuit opened, and the motor drew fuel from both carburetors to boost top-end power. While the XR350 and XR500 were stealing the headlines in '83, the XR250 went on a year-long hiatus. For '84, it was back with an all-new motor, chassis, and suspension. The new bike ditched its XR500 roots and instead took its lead from the smaller, more nimble XR200R. Powering the new bike was a scaled-down version of the RFVC mill used on the XR350R. It featured the same 4-valve head, air-cooled layout, and dual-carb intake. All-new suspension pumped up the travel to 10 inches front and 9.6 inches in the rear, while a Sano front disc brake made stopping a breeze. At a dry weight of 247 pounds, the new XR250R was a whopping 34 pounds lighter than the old 82 250. The new chassis was much more compact, and the overall comfort was better than ever. The new motor was pleasant and revved higher than ever before, but power was still not in overabundance. The new dual carburetors could make jetting the bike a hassle, and if they ever got out of sync, you were in for a world of frustration. The new motor retained the wet sump design of the old mill and shared its habit of running very hot. The quirky 17-inch rear wheel also remained, a feature Honda claimed lowered the seat height and allowed for a more cushy ride. Even with the additional travel of the new suspension, the XR was much happier at puttering over roots than pounding through whoops. Overall, it was a huge improvement, but still no thoroughbred. For 1985, Honda got serious about their four-strokes with a major update to their middleweight XR350 and big-bore XR600R. The new 350 ditched the dual-carb setup and oil-roasting wet sump lubrication system of '84 and replaced it with a simpler, single 35mm carburetor and cooler dry sump configuration for the oil. The new motor retained the radial 4-valve combustion head, but boosted torque with a longer stroke and increased displacement. The rest of the bike was just as new as the motor, and the chassis, suspension, and ergonomics were all greatly improved for 1985. The new 353cc motor came on much stronger down low and pulled harder over a broader range than '84, but it was still not particularly powerful compared to the two strokes of similar displacement available at the time. The bike had excellent torque and a wide power band, but not a lot of thrust past the mid-range. The suspension was still very soft for high-speed work, and at 263 pounds, it was no lightweight. Overall, the new 350 was by far the most competitive XR to date, but still not in the same league as the best enduro bikes from Europe. For 1986, Honda took much of what they learned with the successful '85 redesign of the XR350 and poured that into the XR250R. First up was an all-new motor that aimed to beef up the torque on the rev-happy 250. Learning from what had worked the year before, Honda decreased the bore and increased the stroke on the 249cc motor. Overall displacement remained the same, but now it was an over-square 73 by 59.5 millimeters. The new motor retained the air cooling of the old design, but it added an external oil cooler and a second rotor for the oil pump to combat its habit of roasting the oil. The overall oil capacity was bumped up as well, but the 250 did not get the external oil tank of the XR350. The new 250 retained the basic radial 4-valve combustion head design Honda had been using on its XR since 1983, and made it to an all-new dual-pipe exhaust. On the intake side, the '86 250 also followed the 350's lead by going away from the persnickety dual carbs to a single 30mm Caheen unit. Inside the motor, the 6-speed transmission, gear-driven counterbalancer, and clutch were all carryovers from the old design. In the chassis department, Honda looked to address the major complaints people had voiced about the outgoing design. Chief among these were its lack of stability and flimsy suspension. In the trees, the XR was a surgeon, but if you opened things up, the bike got very twitchy, and its wimpy suspension made riding in big whoops a white-knuckle experience. In order to remedy this, Honda both redesigned the frame and beefed up the suspension components for 1986. First up was a round filing of the old 38mm forks in favor of a set of beefy new 41mm Kiaba units. These components were similar to the ones found on the CR125 at the time, but 2mm smaller in size. A new ProLink rear suspension was also bolted on that ditched the heavy steel swing arm of '85 in favor of a trick alloy unit. Overall travel was also bumped up from 9.6 inches to a full 11 inches of travel for 86. On the frame side, Honda stretched out the riding compartment by moving the steering head forward an inch and a half and lengthening the overall wheelbase by a full 3.5 inches. Overall steering geometry remained very similar to 85, with a 0.5 degree increase in trail over the year before. The new chromoly steel frame was also much stronger for 86, with a large box section down tube and additional bracing throughout. On the trail, the new XR250R was a much improved machine. The redesigned bodywork and new saddle allowed much easier movement fore and aft, and the bike was far slimmer through the middle and up the tank. The new chassis was excellent at slithering through trees and much less spooky at speed. The bike was still a handful in deep sand, but that had as much to do with the XR's mushy suspension as its frame geometry. The new forks offered much less flex, but they were still too soft for anything other than tight woods work. There were 21 adjustable compression settings and a Schrader valve that allowed for air to be added to the forks, but without stiffer springs and a revalve, they were going to continue to be more adept at roots than whoops. In the rear, the new shock was similarly too soft for anything approaching race speed. There were 16 available compression settings and 4 adjustable rebound settings, but even with these cranked up all the way, the shock was a busy and hopping mess in the rough. On hard hits, it slammed to the stops, then shot straight back up at the rider's fanny pack like a nitrogen-charged pogo stick. In deep sand whoops, the XR was a massive handful, and it was best to back off rather than risk being ejected into a yucca bush. On the motor front, the new XR was torquier than ever, but still no stump puller. As with previous 250 XRs, the best method was to keep it pinned and row the excellent 6-speed gearbox. There was good low-end torque and a solid mid-range, but not a ton of top-end thrust. At a peak of 21.9 horsepower, it gave up a full 3 horsepower to Kawasaki's KDX200, no rocket in its own right. Compared to previous XR250s, it was a big improvement, but if you lined up next to a 250 2-stroke, you better hope they were going to foul a plug. On the detailing front, the XR was mostly excellent, with a few disappointments for 86. The new tubular alloy crash bars for the motor cut weight, improved cooling, and looked trick, but offered less protection than the old massive skid plate of 85. The new oil cooler lowered engine temperatures a full 27 degrees centigrade according to Honda, but without the benefit of an external oil tank, the bike continued to run very hot when pushed, with the bike taking between 1 to a dozen kicks when cold and 5 to 5,000 when hot. The new quick detach rear wheel was certainly a plus, and the switch back to an 18-inch rear wheel made tire choices much easier for 1986. Braking was a bit of a mixed bag, with an excellent Nissan dual-piston binder up front and a pathetic and fade-prone drum in the rear. Overall, the new 250 was a major step forward for Honda's XR program. It was far more capable than any XR250 ever offered and a solid trail mount and play racer. For hardcore racing, it was a bit too slow and too soft, but if the conditions were gnarly enough, it could at least keep the smokers in sight. It made a great play bike and a decent Eastern Enduro weapon. Most of all, it was reliable, fun, and capable of taking on any adventure you were inclined to tackle. In the end, isn't that what off-road riding is all about? So there you have it. That's a look back at the all-new 1986 XR250, a machine that stayed in Honda's stable basically unchanged until 1996 when they completely revamped the XR250R. Over the years, they got an upgraded suspension. They upgraded that a little bit, and they also added a disc brake in the early 90s. But more or less, this bike pretty much went for about 10 years without any major significant updates. The later ones still used the same basic motor design. Honda stuck with this for many years, really, until they came out with, I guess, the Unicam design with the CRFs in the early 2000s. This really was the basis from like 83 until the early 2000s for their 4-strokes. The motors weren't particularly powerful. Again, if you ride one of these 250s, they're not like, massive stump pullers, but they're fun. They rev to the moon. They're just, hold it wide open and go. They're super fun. Keep the oil level reasonably under control, and they're very reliable as well. I would love to pick up one myself. Like I said, my buddy Jamie just got one. I'd love to get another one just to play around with. They're just super fun in the woods. Definitely, if you've never had one, I would recommend picking one up. They're just a hoot overall. If you like this sort of thing, make sure you check out some of the other videos I've done. I have all kinds of off-road and motocross related content on my channel. If you could share, subscribe, tweet it out on social media, I would very much appreciate it. Help us grow the channel as well. So until we meet again, this is Tony Blazer for the Motocross Vault. Keep the rubber side down. Peace.